Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I'll be sharing with you how I made the hip and butt padding of this skirt pattern. So if you haven't yet seen the tutorial where I made the blouse, you can as well go down to my channel, or I'm going to leave the link at the description box. So let's start. So for the skirt, I have marked out my waistline, my hip line, and to get your hip line is to mark 7 inches or 8 inches if you're much taller. So from there I went ahead to get my skirt length, which is above my knee. So on the waist part, I'm going to take my tape and I'm going to insert my waist circumference divided by 4. So I won't be adding any sewing allowance to this pattern. I'll be adding it directly to my fabric. So all I'm going to do is just to mark my waist circumference and add my dart allowance. At the hip, I'm just going to measure my hip circumference or at my hip point. So going down to my skirt length, in order to make my skirt a bit fitted, I'm going to be minusing 2 inches at the lower part. Whatever I have at my hip, I'm going to be minusing 2 inches. So my hip is 40 divided by 4. I have 10 inches. So what I'm going to mark is 8. So but actually I removed 1.5, but after drafting the pattern I had to remove ½ inch in order for my skirt to be fitted. So if you want your skirt to be slightly free, you can just use 1.5 at that part, but if you want a fitted skirt, you're going to use 2 inches. So what I'm going to do next is to connect from my waistline to the hip and from the hip to the skirt length. So the next thing I'm going to do is to insert my dart. To do that, I'm going to mark my nipple to nipple measurements, and then from there I'll go down by 6 inches. After going down by 6 inches, I'm going to place my ruler and I'm going to draw a straight line stopping at that 6 inches. At the upper part, I'm just going to mark ½ inch at both sides, and I'm going to connect it down. So after connecting this is the dart for the front skirt pattern. So the next thing I'm going to do is to cut out my skirt pattern, and I'll be cutting for the back part of the skirt also. So after cutting out the skirt pattern, this is what I have. Coming over for the back pattern, what I'm going to do is to mark my zipper allowance first. After doing that, I'll go ahead and place my front pattern on the back pattern. After placing it, I'm just going to pin it down to secure it from shifting. Then I'll go ahead and trace out by the sides, and then I'm going to cut it out. With that, my back pattern is ready. So this is what I have for my front and back pattern. So the next thing is to draw out the area for my hip padding. So for my waistline, I'm going to be coming down by 1 inch at the hip area. So going down to my hip, I'll be coming in by 5 inches. So for my skirt pattern, I'll be going up by 2 inches. So after marking that, the next thing I'm going to do is to connect the lines. After connecting the line, we'll be moving to the back part of the skirt pattern. So I'm just going to label it so that I won't get confused while cutting it. So I'll place this aside and I'm going to move over to the back pattern. So at the back pattern, I'm going to come down by 1 inch from the waistline at the hip part also. So from the zipper part, I'm going to be coming in by 1 inch. So after doing that, I'm going to go ahead and go up by 2 inches at my skirt length. So the next thing I'll do is to place my tape, and I'm going to mark from my waist to my underbutt, where the my underbutt stops, which is 12 inches. And from that line, I'm just going to outline it first and mark it out so that you won't get confused when I make a mark there. So after doing that, I'm just going to place my tape and I'm going to be coming in with 4 inches. So after marking that 4 inches, the next thing is to connect from your skirt length to your underbutt, to your hip and to your waist part. So I'm just going to place this French curve and I'll connect it. So after marking out, this is what I have, and I'll go ahead to cut them out. So before cutting out the hip padding part of my skirt, I'll be placing this on my fabric first before cutting out the hip padding. So while cutting this, I'm going to be making use of a 0.5 inches foam. So 0.5 times 4, I have extra 2 inches on my foam. On my fabric, I will be adding the extra hip allowance. While on my lining part, I'm going to cut exactly my measurement. So don't get confused while I'm cutting that. So on my material, I'll be adding 1 inch sewing allowance to my pattern. So on the fabric part of my dress, I'll be adding extra hip allowance to it, because if you remember, we are going to be padding this pattern. So I'll be making use of a 0.5 inches foam. So I actually went to buy another foam, but I didn't see. So I'll be making use of this pattern. So for our hip and butt pattern, I'll be cutting out 4 pieces of this, 2 for the back and 2 for the side. So this foam is 0.5 inches. 0.5 inches into 4 places will give me 2 inches. So on my hip pattern, I'll be having 42 on my hip, because my original hip is 40 inches plus the 2 inches foam padding. That will be 42 inches. So what I will do at the hip, I'm going to mark my hip circumference divided by 4, my new hip circumference, which is 42, and I'm going to start from the zipper allowance. So after marking it there, 42 divided by 4, then I'll go ahead and add the 1 inch sewing allowance to the hip part. Then I'm just going to continue adding the 1 inch sewing allowance to the end of my pattern. So going down to the skirt part, I'm supposed to add a turning up allowance to the skirt, but because I want to make this video easy and beginner friendly, I'm just going to add ½ inch at the lower part of the skirt. So I will just be sewing with ½ inch to turn up at the lower part of the skirt. So also going to the front part of the skirt, I'll be adding 1 inch joining allowance from the beginning to the end. So when I get to my hip also, remember I'm going to cut out 4 pieces and I'm making use of a 0.5 inch foam. So I'm just going to do my new hip circumference, 42 divided by 4. I'm going to place an mark. After marking, I'm going to go ahead and add 1 inch. So the reason why I'm doing this is that on your fabric, that is where you're going to be adding your hip padding, but on the lining part of your skirt, you are not going to add any extra hip to it. You're just going to use your original hip measurements. So after that, I'll go ahead and join the line. At the lower part, I'll be adding ½ inch for joining at that point. Then I'm just going to cut out. So this 0.5 inch foam is not a constant. You can make use of 1 inch foam or more. So if you're making use of 1 inch foam, by the time you cut out 4 pieces of that, you'll be adding 4 inches allowance to your hip. So going down to my lining, I'm not going to be adding any allowance to the hip, any extra hip on the lining. I'm just going to add the 1 inch joining or sewing allowance at this point. So note, I added the extra hip on my fabric, but I did not add on my lining. Now go ahead and mark 1/2 inch just like I did to join the lining to the fabric. So the next thing I'm going to do is to just cut out my hip padding area. So while cutting, I'm just going to be careful because I went to buy another foam in the market and I couldn't get that, so I had to make use of this particular foam. So it's very light and I'm going to be careful while making use of it. So I'm done cutting and I'm going to just outline my pattern. I'm going to mark the up part, the down part, and the part that is going towards the hip, so that I don't get confused while sewing or joining the hip padding parts. So I'll be joining my skirt pattern on those 1 inch I added. So I'll just be joining my skirt with 1 inch. So this is my front. I'm going to flip it open. I'm going to place the back on it. After placing the back on it, I'm going to sew with with 1 inch by the side, and make sure you sew out your sewing allowance, and make sure while you're cutting you cut exactly your body measurements. So whatever I do to the material, I'm going to do to the fabric. So I'm done joining and this is what I have. So after joining the lining and the fabric, I'm going to be going over to the hip padding. So I'll be working on this part right now. So here is my phone. The next thing I'll do is to join it up, and I'll be taking note of the part that has the hip. That is the part that will be lying at the hip part. But before I join it, I'll be trimming off the sides where I'll be joining the hip to. So the reason why I'm doing this is to make my foam not to be too bulky or poking out at the hip area. So after doing this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch it up with my needle and thread. I'll go back and I will label my hip and butt padding foam. So you can as well use any lining interface to cover your hip and butt padding to give it this very smooth and neat finishing. You're just going to place it, cut it out, and you're going to iron it on it. But this is actually optional if you want to do that. So I'll be inserting my inside the lining. So I'll just go ahead and I will stitch up my foam. So to stitch up your foam, you're going to take note the lower part and the upper part, so that you don't join the down and the up. So I'm just going to go ahead and I will stitch it up with my needle and thread. So I'm doing this because my foam is very soft. So you can go ahead and use your needle, you can go ahead and use your machine to stitch it up. That is if you iron an interface to your hip and butt padding. So what I'm going to do now is to just stitch all my foam paddings together. So after joining my hip and butt padding, this is what I have. This is what it is looking like. So the next thing I'm going to do is to attach it to the lining part. So if you attach it to the lining part of your skirt, this is what it will be looking like. So what I'll do is just to flip the lining open, and you're going to make sure you iron the sewing allowance, the joining allowance you have open on your skirt. So before I attach it, I'm going to measure 1 inch just like I did at the pattern, and I'm going to open up my pattern this way. So after measuring that 1 inch, I'm going to take my hip and butt padding and I'm going to place it starting from 1 inch, and I'm going to pin it down. So while pinning it down, I'm going to make sure the lining is fitted on the hip and butt padding and the sewing or joining allowance is open as well. You're gently going to pin it down to the lining. So after pinning it down to the lining, I'm just going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch it down. So whatever I do to this, I will be doing to the other part of the skirt. So after joining it, after sewing on the sewing machine, this is what I have, and if you can see, it's not shifting, it's well secured on my lining. So the next thing I'll do is to turn it up with my main fabric. So I'm going to place the front part of the skirt facing the front part of the lining. So after doing that, I'll go down and stitch it up with 1/2 inch at the lower part. So right now you can as well turn up your skirt to give it that turn up effect, but I just added 1/2 inch just to sew and to make it easy for a beginner. So while sewing, you're going to make sure the joining on your skirt and the joining of on your lining matches. So after sewing, I'm just going to stitch up the sides also. So I'm just going to do that and bring it for you to see. So after stitching it up, I'm just going to turn it to the right side, and this is what I have. So after turning it, this is what I have. So you can go ahead and iron your skirt pattern so that it's going to relax very well, and this is what the inside looks like. So the next thing I'm going to be doing is to attach band to the dress, and to attach band to the dress, I'm just going to fold the skirt into two this way, and I'm going to notch the center of the skirt. And then the next thing I'll do is to attach my band. So for the band, I cut out 5 inches width and then the length of my waist and my sewing allowance. I measured what I have on my waist and 5 inches width, so that by the time I'm done attaching, I'm going to have something like this. So what I'll do next is on this part, I'm also going to notch my band, and then from there I'm just going to place it and sew with 1/2 inch to the end. After sewing with 1/2 inch, I'm going to fold it up this way, and I'm going to top stitch it back to the wrong side or the lining part of the skirt. So for clarity's sake, I will still explain it back. I'll go down and sew with 1/2 inch. After sewing with 1/2 inch, I'll fold in with 1/2 inch and then place it at the back, and I will top stitch on it from the front, and from there I'm done joining my skirt band. So this is what I have after I'm done joining. As you can see, it's very neat at the back part of the skirt. So the next thing I'm going to do right now is to shape the skirt. So to shape it, I'm going to fold my skirt into two, and I'm going to make sure the sides are meeting each other. So after doing that, I'm going to measure my waist circumference divided by 2. So my waist circumference is 28 inches, and 28 inches divided by 2, whatever I have, I'll divide it by 2 at my waist. 28 divided by 2, I have 14 inches, and I will go ahead to mark that 14 inches at my waistline. So from that my waistline, I'm just going to be measuring about 7 inches down for my zipper allowance. So for a much taller person, you can mark 8 inches. So I'll place and mark 8 inches. So after marking that 8 inches, I'll go in and I will measure my zipper allowance at this point. So whatever zipper allowance you have, you're just going to mark it. So I'm going to mark my zipper allowance. I'm going to take it down to my pattern, and I will stop here to create a little slit. So I'll go ahead and insert my zip. I'll sew this part and then insert my zip at this point. So after doing that, I'll bring it to show you what I have. So with this, we have come to the end of today's tutorial. Please like, share and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on the notification button to get new updates from my channel whenever I post.